Welcome to Stories from the Village of Nothing Much. Like easy listening, but for fiction. I'm Kathryn Nicolai. I write and read all the stories you'll hear on the Village of Nothing Much. Audio engineering and sound design is by Bob Wittersheim. In our show notes, you'll find links to our ad-free premium version, our other shows, and some lovely, soothing merch to make your days and nights sweeter. Love is in the air in the Village of Nothing Much, my friends. We are picking up from last week with the love story of our generation. You know, between Marmalade and Crumb's mom and Birdie's dad. People ask me why the animals all have names, but the humans don't. And if you are curious about that, I will talk a bit about that at the end of the episode. For now, let me remind you that these are simple, happy stories to help you connect with things that feel good. To give you a path through storytelling to calm, relaxed living. If you feel like you missed something, you might want to go back one episode and come back here when you're done. Now, before we start, let's take a deep breath in through the nose and sigh from the mouth. Nice. Again, breathe in and let it out with sound. Good. Our stories today pick up where we left last week as we get closer and closer to a very special event in the village. We'll start with something new, a story about a bicycle ride to a secret place, a hand-drawn map with an X to mark the spot, and the joy of watching a friend fall in love. Then, in something borrowed, we'll head down into the kitchens at the inn as the wedding cake is being made. And we'll talk about cinnamon and cardamom and a gift made with sugar and flour and love and care. Finally, in something blue, we'll climb up the old treehouse ladder on the sycamore and remember how it all started with a little orange kitten and paw prints in the snow. Something new. Though the summer was winding down, the bicycle shop was still busy. We had our now annual autumn rides planned, and our customers were coming in to get tune-ups and have their tires patched or replaced. In my opinion, some of the best riding of the year still lay ahead of us in the months between the heat of summer and the first snow. I'd been riding every day. Well, I always bike into work, as long as it's not bucketing down rain. And on the way back home, I often go out of my way just to ride through neighborhoods and out into the country a bit. Time on a bike always feels like time well spent. I find I do some of my best thinking while pedaling. There's something about my body being engaged, the steady rhythm of my legs that translates to a calm, clear head. If I go too many days without it, I start to feel like a computer with too many windows open. Lately, I'd been riding through a part of town I'd not explored much before. At the end of a long road, which I guess I thought was a dead end, but was in fact a curve, the pavement turned to gravel, and it circled around a small lake. The first time I'd followed the curve and seen the view, I'd stopped my bike, dropping one foot onto the gravel and leaning into my handlebars. I was just a little out of breath and reached for my water bottle and took a long sip. There were a few docks stretched out into the lake, and along the far side were tall pines and a scattering of houses. I slid my bottle back into its holder and started to bike around the lake. Most of the road was shaded by the large old trees, and there was a bit of a breeze coming off the water. I could smell pine and something sweet, maybe lilies or freesia. Beside one of the docks, I spotted an egret, so elegant with his long neck extended as he picked his way through the shallow water. The trip around the lake had only taken a few minutes, and I found on the far side of it several narrow roads to continue my exploration. I was debating adding the route to our next community bike ride, but for now it felt like my secret, and I wanted to keep it. I thought of the grassy lots I'd seen where a picnic blanket could be spread, the shallow spots where lily pads flourished and croaking frogs lived. It was romantic. That was the word I'd been looking for. The spot I'd found was romantic. That was when I realized that I should share my secret bike route, but not with my community riders. Instead, it could be part of a gift. There was a wedding coming up, just a couple weeks away now, and I'd been working on my gift for the couple in my workshop. I'd known them both for a while, but had first met the groom a few years before, when I'd stopped my bike at a dog park. He'd been there with his greyhound Birdie, trying to get him to chase a ball. I'd watched from my bike, chuckling under my breath as he threw the ball again and again, going himself to retrieve it as his dog lay in a cool patch of grass, watching disinterestedly. Eventually he spotted me laughing and laughed himself, coming up to the fence and shrugging his shoulders. "I don't think he wants to play ball," he said. "Nope," I agreed. We started talking, and he told me Birdie was a rescue and had likely run as much as he ever wanted to, so would probably spend the rest of his days lounging away. I asked if I could say hi to him, and he waved me into the fenced area. I've always had a love for greyhounds, and getting to pet Bird's soft gray ears and scratch his chest had made my day. I don't remember when or how, but we bumped into each other again a little while later. Maybe at the bakery or the bookshop, and we'd become friends. We'd gone to the big Friendsgiving party in town together. We'd found a few others to make up a trivia team, and won enough that our names were still up on the blackboard at the pub. Cookouts, movies, me fixing his rickety old bike up whenever it broke down, him telling me about a friend who'd found a little orange kitten and how Bluebird and he had been visiting them. Then that she'd adopted a little dog called Crumb. The name had made me laugh. I started to notice how he talked about her, how much he talked about her, and I wondered if he could hear the smile in his voice whenever he said her name. I could. Sometimes it takes us a while to see what our friends can see so easily. When he'd stopped by the shop and asked if I could help him move a few things, well, actually, everything, I'd laughed and wrapped my arm around his shoulder. We'd had a congratulatory cup of coffee in my workshop, and I'd let him go on about her for as long as he liked. By then, she'd been coming to trivia night for a few weeks, and was the strongest player we had, better than either of us. It was a joy to watch my friend fall in love. And while it was slightly less joyful to help him haul his sofa up her porch steps, I'd been there for that too. And now I'd be standing up with him in the wedding. And between getting my suit fitted and my shoes polished, I'd been building 2 new bikes for them in the shop. They'd need something new for their wedding, and I was getting tired of putting his old bike back together. They were matching cruisers, his gray and hers orange, in tribute to their first beloved pets. I'd added a brown basket to hers so that Crumb would also be represented, and even gotten them a little pet trailer that attached to the back of either bike in case Marmalade the cat ever wanted to go for a ride, which I frankly doubted, having met her. She liked being the queen up on her perch and seemed to prefer to watch the world go by from her window at home. The bikes were nearly ready, shiny and assembled in the workshop, and had been waiting for a final touch, which now I had. I drew a map to the romantic spot by the lake I'd discovered. It took a few attempts. I'd gotten out my ruler and my colored pencils and marked it with an X. I rolled it into a scroll and tied it with a ribbon to his handlebars. Their first date night was sorted. Something borrowed. Sunrise at the inn is a special time of day. I often stand at the end of the dock and watch the sky brightening. Bugs skate over the water, and mist hides the far shore of the lake. It's like a few slow breaths, watch the treetops sway along the shore and last night's stars fade. Then turn and head back toward the inn, stopping at the herb and vegetable gardens along the way to harvest a bit before I step down into the kitchen. As the resident chef, I'm always up early, and taking these quiet moments feels important. I love the bustle of a busy kitchen as well. If I didn't, I guess I'd have found a different profession, but that bit of morning quiet, it's like a crisp, freshly ironed tablecloth to set a colorful spread of food onto. One needs the other. This morning, I took a basket from a stack by the garden shed and filled it with late summer raspberries, fresh mint, tiny tart tomatoes, and a few small cantaloupes that I'd been babying for weeks. We were near the end of the season, so the garden, like one or two of the corridors up on the third floor, was nearly empty. I didn't mind the small reprieve, even though I usually wanted the summer season to go on longer than it did, because we were 3 days away from something big. Something we'd been planning for months. Something that, while we were all looking forward to it, was a big responsibility and a good deal of work. In just a few days, there would be a wedding here at the inn, our first in ages, and our small staff might have had more nerves about it than the happy couple. Or maybe it was just me. The innkeeper seemed calm and ready. She had neat punch lists and timelines drawn up. She regularly assured me that we would have enough champagne, that the flowers had been confirmed, and that she had it on good authority it wouldn't rain. Weddings are special, even when the couple aren't personal friends, which they were in this case. And I always felt the weight of the day, the dreams that I wanted with the food I made to help come true. I thought of my to-do lists as I carried the basket of berries and melons down into my kitchen. I don't usually wear my chef's coat in the inn's kitchen. That was just a bit formal for how I cooked here, so I tied on my apron and fumbled in the pocket for a marker. Any good chef has at least 2 Sharpies on them at any moment, and I found one in the apron pocket and 2 more with their clips threaded onto the collar of my shirt. Even though I was fresh from the shower, I checked behind my ears, as I frequently found them there as well. We had an old scrubbed kitchen table for staff meals in a corner, and I sat down with my notebook and marker and looked at the lists I had for each day until the big one. I heard footsteps coming down the long hall overhead and pausing in the butler's pantry upstairs. That was the innkeeper. She started the coffee each morning, and I imagined her filling the pots and portioning out the fresh grounds. I heard the footsteps moving out onto our dining porch where guests ate breakfast, and I knew she was tidying up the tables, pushing the chairs into even rows and setting out sugar bowls and creamers and small bouquets and bud vases that our gardener prepared. A minute or two later, the footsteps sounded from the kitchen stairs, and she turned the corner with a full cup of coffee in her hands. She set it in front of me, took in my pages of lists and my general anxious air, and rested a hand on my shoulder. With her other hand, she flipped my notebook to today's tasks, blocking out those for tomorrow and the day after, saying, "First this, then that, my friend." I nodded, let out a sigh, and sipped at my coffee. "And I've got good news," she added, pointing to an item on my list that was in all caps and underlined 3 times. The one that said, "wedding cake." "I've called in reinforcements." I lifted an eyebrow, and just then we heard the front door opening, the pleasant creak of the old wood floors in the entryway, and the innkeeper motioned me to follow her up. "Bring your coffee," she said over her shoulder. In the front office where our guests checked in, her apron already on and a giant crate of supplies in her hands, we found the woman who ran the excellent bakery downtown. She had a giant smile on her face, and even this early in the morning was bubbling over with the excitement of baking and creating something very special. As soon as I saw her, my shoulders dropped down from my ears. I let out a huge sigh of relief. "Thank goodness you're here," I said. "You couldn't have kept me away," she laughed. I gave a grateful look to the innkeeper. I wasn't always the best at asking for help. It was something I was working on, and I took a tiny moment to feel the flood of solace in my body and let that be a psychological sticky note reminder that I didn't have to do everything on my own, and that having help actually felt good. I took the crate of supplies and noticed that on top of the extra whisks and beaters were several bakery boxes tied up with string. There was still warmth rising up off of them. "I brought cardamom buns, enough for your guests' breakfast and for ours," she said as we made our way back down the long hall. "That way you can skip doing breakfast service and we can get right to the good stuff." "I could kiss you," I said as I turned the corner and led the way to the kitchen. "One wedding at a time, please," the innkeeper called from the pantry. In the kitchen, we laid out the buns and chafing dishes where they could stay warm as our guests rose and made their way to the porch. They smelled so delicately of cardamom and were sprinkled with pistachios and crushed rose petals. We carried them up and found some pretty china dessert plates in the pantry to serve them on. The sun was an inch above the horizon now, and the porch smelled of a mix of fresh coffee and dewy grass. We filled our cups, took a bun each, and went back to the table to plan everything out. As we sipped and ate, I sketched out the design I had in mind. She made a few suggestions how best to stabilize the tiers, timing for when each layer would be crumb-coated and left to set up in the freezer. "Well," she said, rolling the last sip of coffee around in the bottom of her cup, "I understand the plan, but you haven't told me yet. What kind of cake is this? What flavor are we making?" I smiled down at the table and propped my chin in my hand. I thought about that for a long time. They said from the beginning that they trusted me to choose. And I have this recipe. I'm kind of careful about it. I don't give it out, She raised her eyebrows from across the table. "Your coffee cake recipe? It's famous. People even ask me for it, thinking I might know, but I've never been able to recreate it. That swirl of cinnamon crunch through the center and the crumb on it, it's fantastic." She spoke with reverence and a question in her voice, knowing what it meant for me to share something that special. "Well, they'll need something borrowed, won't they?" I said, shrugging my shoulders as if it were casual. It wasn't. "Just this once. I'll share it." She raised her cup in salute, then swallowed the last of her coffee. "Your secret is safe with me, Chef." I knew it was. We pushed away from the table and went to wash our hands. A day full of baking lay ahead of us. All of my nerves were forgotten now that I had someone to share the work and my special recipe with. It would be a wonderful day. Something blue. There was a sycamore tree on the far side of the rose garden at the inn. She had once held a treehouse in her branches, but that was many, many years ago. One late spring, a windstorm had brought it tumbling down, and it had never been rebuilt, but there remained enough of the ladder, smallish wood planks nailed into the trunk, that with a bit of care one could climb up and settle into the crook of the first hardy branch. And for a cat, it was even easier. So we sat, me and my dear Cinder. She was a small gray cat who walked on silent paws and watched me with yellow eyes. I leaned back against a branch as she climbed deftly into my lap. We turned our faces up to the sky. The leaves around us were just beginning to turn and would soon be the color of Cinder's eyes. Beyond their canopy, we were watching for the weather to turn, for the day to brighten and the clouds to clear. Today was the day it seemed the whole village had been waiting for. A wedding, here at the inn, and we were trying to deliver on our gift to the happy couple. Cinder and I had known the bride for a few years, and, if we did say so ourselves, had a hand and a paw in their love story. It started when Cinder found a tiny orange kitten, lost and alone on a cold day. She'd brought her to our shop in downtown, dragging her through the cat flap by the scruff of her neck, and setting her into my lap as I sat in the big winged armchair by the window. I'd wrapped her in my shawl and gone to find a dish and some food. Once she'd eaten and fallen asleep in Cinder's bed, we looked at each other and tried to decide what to do next. As I often do when I'm in need of a bit of guidance and inspiration, I took my grandmother's grimoire down from its place on the shelf and paged through it. I'd inherited this book and my talents from her, and it often felt like she could still talk to me through it. How many times had I come to it with a question and opened it straight to the page with the answer? That day I'd held the book in my hands and looked at the small cat curled up at my feet and wondered, where should she be? Was someone missing her? Was she meant to stay with me and Cinder? I let the book fall open, and my eyes landed on the words, Lost and Found, a spell for location and placement. Thank you, Gran, I'd whispered as I read her direction. The spell involved a tricky kind of knot tied with yarn or string, and as I sat down at my table, I looked down to see Cinder dragging a skein of blue yarn out of my knitting basket. Thanks to you too, I said as I reached down for it. I cut a stretch of the fiber, and as I tied it, per Gran's instructions, I thought about the orange kitten. I found a few of her hairs on my shirt and tied them into the knot as well. Before I'd even finished it, I knew where she was meant to end up. This is often how spells work for me. The mere act of focusing part of my mind on the process frees up another part to intuit what is needed and how to bring it about. I had a friend who'd lost her beloved cat a few years before, and part of the wound of grief his passing had left behind was still unhealed. The chamber of her heart that wanted to love again was closed up. She was stuck and didn't even know it. And here was this irresistible kitten, small and in need, and I felt sure would win over my friend in an instant, would force her heart open and let the light into its closed-up corners. So I tucked the little girl into my coat, buttoning it up around her, and Cinder and I tromped over to my friend's house as snow began to fall. I'd realized as I was tying that knot that if I knocked on her door and tried to convince her to take the kitten in, the spell might fall apart. No, that would cause her to make a decision with her head, and we needed to deal directly with her heart. So we waited till it felt like the time was right, and I set the little cat down at the edge of her front walk. She didn't give me a backward glance. I think she knew she was home. She just started leaving tiny paw prints in the fresh snow all around the front door, then ducked under a shrub in the yard. From a distance, I saw my friend come around the corner of her house. She spotted the prints and stopped short. Cinder jumped up onto my shoulder and purred as we watched her face shift. Her eyes followed the prints. It had taken a little while. A cardboard box with a blanket and a dish of borrowed kibble from the neighbor, but eventually they'd found each other. And that moment had marked a shift for my friend. Not all at once, but bit by bit, she'd become more willing to ride the ups and downs of loving another. Next, she and the kitten she'd named Marmalade made room in their house for a little scruffy pup named Crumb. And here we were, after a few more turns in the road, on her wedding day, marrying a man she'd come to love after his dog Bluebird had brought them closer. From our spot in the tree, their love story fresh in my mind, I peeked up again at the sky. I knew they'd be needing something blue for their wedding, and my gift to them was, fingers crossed, a blue sky. Clear, excellent weather for the wedding taking place later today by the lake. The innkeeper had called me, actually, when the date was first decided upon and asked my opinion. I remember standing by the stove in the shop with the phone in my hand, looking down into my simmer pot, which was steaming scents of cinnamon, star anise, and peppermint into the air, all good for waking up my second sight. I'd asked the innkeeper to repeat the date again, and as she did, let my attention travel through my body. Not trying to do anything, really, just listening for how it felt. Blue skies, my friend, I'd said into the phone. But they'd been gray when we'd woken. So we'd come to keep watch from this old sycamore. I laid my hand on the rough bark beside me and imagined the whole environment around us shifting. The chill in the air being driven out as the clouds rolled back. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes and breathed deeply, thinking of my friend standing in her dress by the lake, the afternoon sun shining down around her, and her sweetheart. I smelled it before I saw it. Like a hayride on a crisp day, the sun hitting the dry leaves ready to fall. When I opened my eyes, the skies were a bright September blue, and down the drive of the inn, a slow procession of guests were arriving. Cinder climbed up onto my shoulder, and we descended down the old treehouse ladder. It was nearly time. Oh, what a joy to revisit these stories. I am not a planner when it comes to my writing. In fact, because of some brain differences I have, strategizing is almost impossible for me. I always say that my brain doesn't have any drawers. It's just one open workspace, and once it's crowded, things fall off and easily get lost. So I can't look that far ahead in my stories. Instead, and this is a gift many artists might recognize, my subconscious plants seeds as I go. And one day, a flower blooms that is exactly the right shade and the perfume for my purposes, and it feels like magic. I certainly didn't plan for this wedding arc. I wasn't aware anything had taken root, but suddenly we were there. This is how I felt about the whole storyline. Oh, and I promised to explain why none of my human characters have names, but all of the animals do. And this is because I always wanted listeners to feel like they could step into these tales and be a part of them. I think that is part of what makes them useful bedtime stories, if you can kind of pull the story around your shoulders like a blanket and imagine yourself in it. So I deliberately never named any of the people. And in most romantic situations, I didn't specify gender, this particular story arc being the lone exception. And like I mentioned a moment ago, it wasn't one I planned or saw coming. But for the animals, I felt like naming them made the stories more salient, more real. I think it's like how you might not know all your neighbors' names, but you do know their pets' names. We start with the bicycle shop owner, one of the few male narrators I have so far, which is really just because I center women in all things. But he is an excellent example of non-toxic masculinity. I liked writing about him realizing that his friend had fallen in love before his friend did, which is something that happened to me, and I'm saving for a special story one day. When the second story about Chef and the baker came out, some listeners had some very strong feelings about it. One was that this might be the start of a love story for the two of them, and that this didn't seem right because wasn't Chef sort of into the bookshop keeper? After that invitation out to the winter getaway, episode 5, in case you need to revisit. And those are always interesting moments for me, especially when I have a feeling about who has a soft spot for who and listeners have different opinions. I feel like, first of all, Chef and the bookshop keeper are just friends. And that made the reason that Chef asked her to visit the ski chalet so much purer. And solid friendships are so important as we get older. So I was like, Also, I think there have been some sparks between the baker and the waitress at the diner. Your Honor, I'd like to enter episode 31 as Exhibit C. And that Chef is a bit of a rolling stone and probably breaks hearts wherever they go. The second bit of controversy was about making a coffee cake into a wedding cake. And this one surprised me because even as a relatively experienced home baker, I didn't see it as an issue. I figured Chef would be adapting the recipe to the form, so I don't think they used the bundt tins. And hey, I'm just going to say it was a good decision, and it did come out wonderfully. Harumph. Finally, our head witch from the village coven, sitting in that sycamore tree with Cinder, was so fun to write. To be able to revisit Marmalade's origin story and add in the extra of the knot magic and grandmother's grimoire and make it all about a love story, I loved it. And it's also foreshadowing a story coming up about a new kitty that's going to live in the village named Sycamore. I don't think I'm going to shock anyone when I say I'm a little witchy. Even before I started telling bedtime stories, when I was a full-time yoga teacher, I would often watch how I could use my voice and words and just the energy I brought to a space to cast a kind of spell that could help folks let their guard down and dig into things that mattered. And over the last few years, my magic practice has been about reconnecting to my own intuition, which many of us are taught to ignore as we're growing up, and can lead us to a place where we don't know what we want, or not even sure what feels good, or who we are. The first time you were forced to hug someone who gave you the creeps. The first time you were told, in this house, we clean our plates. Those were moments you were taught to distrust your intuition. And digging your way out of that hole can take a while, but it can be really empowering and healing. The Witches of Nothing Much are a group of folks who work behind the scenes to make life feel a little sweeter for their fellows. They see people hurting and step in with a kitty, or they help plants grow. They make a lot of connections in this little town that thrives on them, and ultimately I see myself as the same, just trying to use the magic of storytelling to connect people, and feeling very, very lucky that I get to do it as a job. Well, we are almost to the wedding itself, so till next week, be gentle with yourself, try trusting your own intuition, and see where it leads you. Hopefully, it will lead you back here to the Village of Nothing Much.